There is no evidence that Donald Trump has committed a crime. Everyone knows that. This has been the most transparent presidency.
I believe you just lied under oath. There is ample evidence in the Epstein file.
Don't you ever accuse me of a crime.
I believe you just lied under oath, and this is all on videotape. Epstein should rot in hell, so should the men who patronized his operation. And you have not held a single man accountable. Shame on you. If you had any decency, you would resign right after this hearing concludes.
The gentleman has...
So a recent batch of Epstein files were just released, and especially in light of everything that we saw in those documents, it was a sad and very startling indictment on the reality and the depravity and how low that humanity can go when Satan is in control. But as we're going to see in this particular session, what we saw in those Jeffrey Epstein documents is nothing new. As we think about the history of the United States and its connection with the institution of slavery and its attendant consequences, and also its connection with ancient heathenism, we're going to see the unfortunate stream, the connection that runs through all of these particular episodes of human history. Now, just starting off, when we look at Ephesians chapter 6 and verse number 12, the Bible mentions very clearly that there is spiritual wickedness in high places. And so everything that we think about as it related to Jeffrey Epstein is merely a revelation of that fact. And even before we get into some of the details, it's very important for us to understand that it was not merely just Jeffrey Epstein running this operation. And we're not even going to get into necessarily all of the idiosyncrasies that pertain to that. But sadly, the mainstream media with its attendant power structure is trying to convince us as common people that it was merely just Jeffrey Epstein running all of this. But as again, the Bible reveals that there is a connected system of debauchery and depravity that allowed this experience again with Jeffrey Epstein to be made possible. Now, it's very interesting. Manly Palmer Hall, this gentleman was an esoteric writer in the 20th century. He wrote a book called The Secret Teachings of All Ages. Notice what this man says. He says the most dangerous form of black magic is the scientific perversion of occult power for the gratification of personal desire. It says its less complex and more universal form is human selfishness. For selfishness is the fundamental cause of all worldly evil. So this is just very clearly revealing that we don't have to be a warlock, we don't have to be a witch in order to be practicing black magic. The only thing that we have to do is to be selfish. Very startling. But notice what he goes on to say. This says, a man will barter his eternal soul for temporal power, and down through the ages, a mysterious process has been evolved which actually enables him to make this exchange. So we can just very simply conclude that Jeffrey Epstein and his associates unfortunately had made this barter with the Prince of Darkness. We think about, for instance, the experience of Jesus with Satan in Matthew chapter 4. While Jesus rejected the invitation to bow down to Satan, to worship him for all of the grandeur of this world, unfortunately, Jeffrey Epstein and many elite in this world today are, instead of rejecting the offer of Satan, they are actually accepting the invitation. But notice what Manly Palmer Hall goes on to say. The mysteries were therefore established, and when he says mysteries, he's talking about things like the Illuminati, Freemasonry. The mysteries were therefore established for the purpose of unfolding the nature of man according to certain fixed rules, which when faithfully followed, elevated the human consciousness. Now again, we're not going to go through all of the details, but when you study a lot of the nature of these secret societies, all the debauchery that we saw in those Epstein files, many of these ruling elite, they actually believe that all of those debased practices actually elevate them to a place of deity. I mean, it's literally insane, the satanic science that these men and women follow. It says elevated the human consciousness to a point where it was capable of cognizing its own constitution and the true purpose of existence. So again, this is just re-emphasizing that unfortunately, these ruling elites are believing the lie of Satan that we see in Genesis chapter 3, that by engaging in sin and wickedness to its very lowest dregs, that they are going to be on par even with the deity himself. So very sad. But notice this news article. Was Jeffrey Epstein really involved in cannibalism? Now, unfortunately, it was clearly revealed that these were practices that these ruling elite were allegedly engaging in. Absolute insanity. It says, here's what the DOJ files reveal. It says, after the DOJ released the files, multiple claims on social media accuse Epstein of reportedly eating babies and engaging in cannibalism and in ritualistic sacrifice. Dear family, friends, many times, especially over the past history, 10, 20, 30 years, it was thought for a very long period of time that all of these accusations about the ruling elite, that all of these things were just wild conspiracy theories concocted by fringe conspiracy theorists with tinfoil hats and all of this. But again, just corroborating the words of the sacred volume, there is spiritual wickedness in high places. The person at the very bottom claimed to have witnessed ritualistic sacrifices and babies being dismembered. Again, some of the details of these accusations are so, again, debauched that even meditating upon it has the tendency to degrade the human mind. But again, dear family, in light of everything that pertains to this Jeffrey Epstein situation, we want to understand, and we're going to find out, that the things that we saw in those documents, this is not a new phenomenon. This has been taking place by the ruling elite for a very long period of time, and this is even nothing new, even to the American experience. This is a symbol of something called slavery. I wonder if there is any connection between the reality of this Epstein release and also the epoch of American slavery and the degradation of black persons in this country. I wonder if there's a connection. This is a man on the screen by the name of Eric Williams. He was the first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. Notice what this man says about the institution of slavery. This says, here then is the origin of Negro slavery. The reason was economic, not racial. I'll read it again. The reason was economic, not racial. And Eric Williams is actually going to go on and clearly communicate that it's not that racism was not involved in the institution of slavery, but its primary objective was economics. The racial reality of the racism was merely used as the so-called moral justification in order to substantiate the barbaric institution. But notice Eric Williams goes on to say, it was survival of the fittest. Both Indian slavery and white servitude were to go down before the black man's superior endurance, docility, and labor capacity. The features of the man, his hair, color, and dentifrice, his subhuman characteristics so widely pleaded, were only the later rationalization to justify a simple economic fact. And again, while there is an economic fact that was associated with the institution of slavery, you better be sure that that was the same reality connected with the Epstein situation. And again, as it pertained to the institution of slavery, its primary objective was economics, not merely racism. Now on our screen is a man by the name of John Henry Hopkins. This man was the first Episcopal bishop of Vermont during the 19th century, I believe, either 18th or 19th century. Now notice what this man says, and the reason why we're going through this is that this man is actually going to try to give the moral justification that was used in order to substantiate the institution of slavery. And some person may ask, well, why are we going through some of this history? It's the reason why, especially in connection with the Epstein situation, we're going to see that some of the same moral justifications that so-called religionists were using to justify the barbarities of slavery are the same moral justifications that the ruling elite have tried and are trying to use in order to justify their depravities that we saw in those Epstein files. But notice what John Henry Hopkins says about his thoughts on slavery. This says, the whole object of my letter was to prove from the Bible that in the relation of master and slave, there was necessarily no sin whatsoever. Lord have mercy. The sin, if there were any, lay in the treatment of the slave and not in the relation itself. So Henry Hopkins is trying to communicate to you and I, those of his generation and even in the present, that the problem was not chattel slavery, it was merely the execution of the chattel slavery. Insanity. But notice what he says. Of course, it was liable to abuse, as all human relations must be. But while it was certain that thousands of our Christian brethren who held slaves were treating them with kindness and justice, Lord have mercy, according to the apostles' rule, and earnestly laboring to improve the comforts and ameliorate the hardships of the institution. So John Henry Hopkins was actually trying to communicate that there was nothing wrong with chattel slavery. It was merely the execution of the institution, even going so far as to say that the slaves were being treated with kindness and even justice. And as we're clearly going to see as we go on, that some of the same practices that we saw in the Epstein files were the same things that were being meted upon black persons here in this country during the institution of slavery. But notice this. John Henry Hopkins says, I do not believe that Washington, talking about George Washington, and his compatriots who framed our Constitution with such express provisions for the right of slaveholders were tyrants and despots, sinners against the law of God and the feelings of humanity. And this is a very good point to just hone in on. Unfortunately, as a result of so much of the propaganda that we have received as Americans and the deification that has taken place of some of the very many quote-unquote heroes of the American experience, very sadly, very many of us have become unable to rightly judge human character. One of the very great beauties of the history of the Bible is that God does not whitewash the transgressions of even some of the greatest men who have ever lived. So while it is true that there was genius expressed by George Washington, while there was genius expressed by people like Thomas Jefferson, this does not take away from the fact of us needing to really understand, even to a very great degree, the nature of their transgressions, how they affected people of their time, and their subsequent effect even upon this present generation. But notice what Henry Hopkins goes on to say. But I do believe in the teaching of the inspired apostles and in the Holy Catholic or Universal Church, which you and your clergy also profess to believe. I know that the doctrine of that church was clear and unanimous on the lawfulness of slavery for 18 centuries together. Unfortunately, dear family, most people do not understand and know that the Catholic institution bears a great majority of the guilt associated with the transatlantic slave trade. Most people do not understand that it was that satanic institution that gave the moral justification to kingdoms like Spain, Portugal, and so on, France, and all the rest. And while it is true that the government of England, the United Kingdom, was not directly under the auspices of the Roman Catholic institution, especially with its breaking away in the 16th century, the principles of the Catholic institution still undergirded the expansion of Western governments in Western Europe. Now, on our screen is a gentleman by the name of Alauda Equiana. This man was a former slave that wrote in the 18th and I believe 19th century, or the 17th and 18th century. Notice what this man says about the things that he observed in the institution of slavery. While I was thus employed by my master, I was often a witness of cruelties of every kind, which were exercised on my unhappy, unfallen slaves. It was almost a constant practice with our clerks and with other whites to commit violent depredations on the chastity of female slaves. So he's talking about sexual violence on women. I have known them gratify their brutal passions with females, notice, not yet 10 years old. And it's amazing that there were even some conservative commentators like Megyn Kelly that were trying to communicate to us that Jeffrey Epstein was not doing pedophile things with little children, but it was merely just girls slightly under the age of 18. Brothers and sisters, again, some of the same pseudo-moral justifications that were given to justify the barbarities of slavery are some of the same sadistic and satanic moral justifications that men and women are even using in this generation to justify what Jeffrey Epstein and his associates were doing. But notice what Alauda Equiana goes on to say. By the reported cruelties of the wretched murdered in the West Indies, they were cut and mangled the slaves in a shocking manner on the most trifling occasions. So some of the same cutting up of the human body, the same dismembering that we saw in those Epstein files, were the same things that were practiced during the institution of slavery. Dear family, all of this is a sad indictment upon the nature and reality of human nature. But again, all of this is merely just a modern reiteration of ancient heathenism. Notice what the Bible says in the book of Leviticus in chapter 18. In verse number 18, neither shalt thou take a wife to her sister to vex her, to uncover her nakedness beside the other in her lifetime. Also thou shalt not approach unto a woman to uncover her nakedness, as long as she be put apart for her uncleanness. Verse 20, moreover thou shalt not lie carnally with thy neighbor's wife to defile thyself with her. Verse 21, and thou shalt not let any of thy seed pass through the fire to Molech, neither shalt thou profane the name of thy God. I am the Lord. Thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind. It is abomination. So all of the things that God just described that were associated with ancient heathenism, whether it be adultery, fornication, homosexuality, bestiality, pedophilia, and even the sacrificing of children that we now call abortion in this generation, all of these things were associated again with what we see with that Jeffrey Epstein situation that we currently have in this generation, and also through the experience of slavery here in the Americas. And sadly, again, family, all of this is merely just an indictment, a sad indictment upon the reality, unfortunate reality of human nature. This is a particular quotation from volume 1 of the Testimonies to the Church. Notice this. The people of this nation have exalted themselves to heaven and have looked down upon monarchical governments and triumphed in their boasted liberty, while the institution of slavery, that was 1,000 times worse than the tyranny exercised by monarchical governments, was suffered to exist and was cherished. So what this is communicating, and many times, especially when we think about the institution of slavery here in the Americas, many times people will say, well, there are many cultures and civilizations over the course of human history that have practiced slavery, and that is very true. But sadly, the type of slavery that was practiced here in the Americas, the chattel slavery, was far more barbaric than anything that has ever existed in the society of nations, even communicating to the point that many of the barbarities that were witnessed in the Spanish Inquisition pale into insignificance in light of the debaucheries that were heaped upon the slaves here in the Americas. The slavery in this nation, as compared to slavery in other cultures and nations, was not the same thing. Slavery, chattel slavery here in the Americas was truly one of the great stains upon the human experience throughout all time. In this land of light, a system is cherished which allows one portion of the human family to enslave another portion, degrading millions of human beings to the level of the brute creation. And it is very sad that even in this generation, that there are many so-called Christians that have become apologists for the transgressions of the United States. Again, dear family, because of so much of the propaganda that we as American citizens have been educated in, very many of us cannot see very clearly what the United States has been from its embryonic beginning. As Revelation 13 very clearly points out, though it would seem to be a lamb, it would speak as a dragon. Now on the screen is a very interesting depiction of the worship of the god Molech. Now notice this particular quotation from a gentleman by the name of Herodotus. He was a 5th century Grecian historian. Notice what he says about the worship of ancient heathenism. The Mendesians then reverence all goats and the males more than females. It says in the middle in red, and both the goat and Pan are called in the Egyptian tongue Mendes. Moreover, in my lifetime there happened in that district this marvel. That is to say, a he-goat had intercourse with a woman publicly, and this was so done that all men might have evidence of it. Dear family, unfortunately, we see the very distinct correlation between the Jeffrey Epstein situation, the institution and experience of chattel slavery here in the Americas, and its connection with ancient heathenism. In light of these great revelations that God is allowing to be flooded upon the social consciousness, this should be the clearest indication for us to get yoked up to Christ. God is allowing us to see that Satan and everything that he is offering in this world cannot satisfy the human heart. And if persons continue in league with the enemy, the same debauched practices that were revealed in the Epstein files is going to be the level that Satan degrades the entirety of the human family. And this is appeal to all viewers. In light of us seeing the revelations in these Epstein files, I pray that this be a clarion call for us to run to Christ. As the Bible says in Revelation 18, it is time for us to come out of her, my people. God is showing us very clearly that this world has nothing to offer. That in light of everything that we are seeing, the degradation of humanity, we need to understand the grave necessity of running to Christ before it is forever too late. Thank you again so much for joining us in this particular session, and by God's grace, we will see you in the next video.